Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad you joined me here today, so do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you can be notified of future updates, and as well as we could get a 5-star review, that would be most appreciated. And spread the word. We'd like to get more people involved in getting a hold of these particular training sessions on vertebrate pest and living the wildlife. If you don't like dealing with YouTube, you can also download my podcast over at Rumble. Just go to Wildlife Control Consultant, look up that term, and my podcast will come up there as well. Had a pretty good week. I hope your week went well. I did a fair amount of driving here in Montana. I had the opportunity to do some training in town. I haven't done any training before yet in the state, so and the crowd was truly remarkable, and then had the opportunity to train it and give some training at another location. Again, the people were very gracious, and it was a great time, so I really appreciated that. Hope your week went well as also, and so we're going to be, of course, covering a new topic here. If you want to have a topic covered that I haven't covered, we're into our fifth year, I believe now, with the Living the Wildlife podcast. You can definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. Ideas for shows, questions that you might have, and then of course, yes, even criticisms, we'll take that as well. Well, we're moving, of course, into spring. I'm recording today on May 5th, 2023, and we're getting into those situations where there are young and sometimes animals die, and there are associated odors. And so one of the challenges, of course, in wildlife control is the problem of how do we remove odors and find those odors. I guess it's more important. How do we find those odors for our client when they're kind of mysterious, when they tend to be transient? How do we find those odors? So I wanted to talk a little about some strategies that you can use to help find those particular odors and help your client resolve a particular issue. So kind of a difficult topic to deal with in an online forum, because some of the odors, of course, you just have to smell it to know it, right? It's kind of how do you describe an odor? It's just something you've either experienced or you haven't, but we'll try to do some of that here. So let me pull up my PowerPoint here and get that started off. So this week's course topic is how do we find odors, and how do we find those odors for our client. So when we're dealing with types of odor, we have various types. Now, this isn't necessarily a complete list, but it kind of gives you an idea that you want to be thinking about where those odors might be coming from, because there's going to be different elements on how to locate where those odors are coming from. So you need to kind of have some boxes to think about. So what are some of those types of odors? Well, of course, you have food. I had a job once where a person called me up and had me come out. He just had this horrendous odor, and it was definitely something rotting. It was awful. It was quite a unique odor. And we're searching around the house, and I just started keying in. It was in the kitchen where we were smelling it, and something just motivated me to open the microwave. And there it was. He had cooked some, I think it was Chinese food, if memory serves, and it was just in there for way, way too long, and it was nasty. And it really was shocking because you would have thought that the owner would have identified where that was, and he didn't, right? And so I was fortunate enough to just simply, something told me just to open it up, and I just opened it up, and there, boom, there it was. Sometimes, as I say, it's better to be lucky than good. Well, that's so we identified it in that kitchen area. So obviously, food-borne odors can be an issue because sometimes people are thinking that it's an animal, and it's not. Sometimes food falls in between, like the stove and the countertop, and they don't see it, and it begins to rot, and then it kind of gets this nasty odor. So never rule out issues such as food. Dead. Now, by that dead, I mean sort of like dead animal smell. And so once you experience a dead animal smell, you're not going to forget. Even someone with chronic sinus problems that I have, once you smell it, you know, okay, something died here. And so that can certainly be helpful in terms of narrowing down where those odors might be. Urine will often have an ammonia smell. I mean, we all use restrooms, and sometimes they're not cleaned as well as they could be. So that odor should be relatively straightforward. That can be an issue. Cat odor, for example, can be another one. Issues of mold, for example, when maybe there's a moisture issue in the house and the person misidentifies it, and then it turns out it's not really animal, it's actually a water issue or mold. On a side note here, we could talk about, sometimes people smell a dead odor and it's actually a broken sewer pipe, or, well, y'all, in terms of piping, where there's that sort of elbow underneath your sink. Take a look underneath your sink when you go home, or when if you're in your office, go to the bathroom and look at the sink. You'll see the elbow, right? The S that's there. Well, that is to hold water in that trap to prevent the sewer gases from coming into the house. Well, sometimes that water evaporates if someone doesn't use that sink for an extended period of time. Well, the water in there evaporates, allowing gases. That happened in a house that I was in, where we have a couple of bathrooms, and we don't use this bathroom for the shower. And we started having this sort of bad odor, and it had a sewery type smell to it. And it finally occurred to me, I just need to run the bathtub a little bit just to refill that, and the odor just went right away. Well, sometimes those pipes crack, and that can be an issue. And so often you'll have, so it's sort of like those sewer flies that can occur. They're actually sort of more, I guess they are flies as opposed to moths, but there is sometimes some insects will be associated with that as well, telling you that there's a broken sewer pipe underneath the floor and things like that. So that's certainly a place where odor can emerge as well. Skunk, all of you, if you've been in business for any length of time, should be very familiar with skunk odor, and that can be a common one, where there is sometimes a dead skunk and that bag breaks. I can assure you there is nothing like it. One of the tips I tell people is that if the odor of skunk is getting stronger, it often signifies that there's a dead skunk on the property. It can be quite overpowering. When I was in business, I actually enjoyed the smell of skunk, but even a dead skunk, when that sack opens up, even that was a bit strong for me, and it was quite intense. And so you can imagine for what it is for homeowners. And so it can penetrate through the cracks of foundations and get up into the house, even though the dead animal may be under the deck or in a window well where the skunk got trapped and died. But we also have living animal smells. For example, bat guano and bat urine. That can be, again, it's a unique odor, and you'll get familiar with that over time if you're dealing in this business long enough. Heavy mice infestations will also have sort of that unique odor as well. And then, of course, raccoons. Raccoons can have a really pungent odor as well. And as other animals, if you encounter them to those levels of intensity, perhaps maybe flying squirrels would be another. Typically, it's animals that are large or can stay in an area for an extended period of time where you can have some of those odors, like bats and mice, and of course raccoons will stay for an extended period of time. So kind of get a feel for what those odors are. It's going to be hard to describe that to a client, but the point is that you want to be thinking about, I had a whole podcast about having your own wildlife control calendar, for instance, and that can be helpful in terms of narrowing down what the culprit might be, for example. And so having at least some boxes to be thinking about odors, that where you're going to look, because if you walk into the house and you smell that odor and you identify, okay, that's raccoon, well, where would a raccoon typically be? Typically be in an attic, might be in a wall, could be down below, but raccoons like to go high. But there's a lot of, you have to kind of check things out to see where things are normal. Never look for the outlier issue. Always think about what the most common sources are and move from there. So that helps you. But how do you deal with your client? So your client calls you up and they say, hey, I've got this odor. I need help. We don't know where it's coming from, or we don't know what it is. But they think it's an animal. Or they think it's animal related. Maybe someone referred them to you. Maybe it was a pest control company that referred them to you. So you need to kind of interview your client to get an idea of what exactly is going on. And so obviously one of the questions you're going to need to ask is, where do they smell the odor the strongest? Is it a bedroom? Is it the basement? Is it a bathroom? Is it in the upper floor? Is it outdoors, for instance? Okay. So that's going to be important for you to identify. Is it inside the house? Is it outside the house? When do they smell the odor? Is it all the time? Does it occur like when the furnace turns on or when they walk into certain rooms? Those are going to be things that are going to be important for you to help tease out. And again, people are often poor historians. So you're going to need to kind of ask some of the same questions in different ways to see if that person, as they're reflecting through their memory, things begin to evolve. Try to talk to people who are really on the ground. Like, don't talk to the secretary when it's the boss's house, right? So you need to talk to people that are intimately involved with the location and have personal experience. Otherwise, you might be making a trip out there and kind of wasting your time. Then you're charging a service call for someone and you're not able to really give them kind of advice that they need and give the service to sort of make them feel better about paying your price. And so that can reduce some conflicts there if you do that good interview. Ask the client, what activities have they been involved in? For example, what I mean is, did they have a mouse problem, for example, that they started using rodenticide for? That can be an indication of perhaps there's a bunch of dead mice. Maybe they should have trapped first, reduced that population, but they didn't. They may have hit it with rodenticide, and now you have a lot of dead mice around, and they've gotten into the walls. Always keep in mind that odor is a very personal issue. I've had situations where I found a dead squirrel in someone's attic, and they never knew it was there. Odor, in order to be perceived, has to be, of course, there has to be a source. The source has to be able to transmit that odor to a location where the person smelling it can actually experience it. And then you're dealing with how sensitive of a nose does the person have who's experiencing it. You've all heard the philosophical conundrum, for example. If a branch falls in the forest and no one's there, did it make a sound? Well, it doesn't matter what the answer to that is. It's the same way with odor. If no one is there to smell it, then it's not a problem. And if the odor is there, but the person doesn't smell it, it's not a problem unless it's so pungent that other people are smelling it when the person leaves the house. So we need to be looking at how severe is this particular issue. Has the client done any controls for the odor? Have they used deodorants? Did they do cleaning? Did they use, scented candles, for example? Have they done any of those things? Because that's going to also interfere with your ability to smell the odor. But it also can tell you how strong that odor was. But some people, remember, are exceedingly sensitive. They've got dog-like noses, if I can say that. Right? Obviously, that's not true. But compared to someone like me, some people have incredible noses. Okay, so they could be remarkably sensitive to various odors where you come in and you don't smell a thing. And so you want to make sure you try to find out, what are you walking into? So when you arrive at the location, you have to ask, is the odor indoors or outdoors? So if it's outdoors, you need to be thinking about where would the animal be located, or where would the odor be coming from? Is it a stink pipe? Is it an animal underneath a deck? Is it an animal underneath a shed? Is it perhaps a skunk that sprayed next door? Keep in mind that skunk odor can easily transmit over a quarter of a mile or farther. And so when people are telling me, well, I went outdoors and I smelled skunk, so a skunk must be around. Yeah, maybe. It might be, but you can have a family of skunks underneath your deck with no odor. It depends on whether they've been disturbed and squirt off. Juveniles, of course, squirt off pretty easy. It doesn't take much to have them squirt off because they're nervous, right? So, but you can have people who think they have skunks just because they smelled an odor and the skunks aren't there. They smelled it from next door. Perhaps one got hit by a car. Perhaps one sprayed a dog. Okay, so you want to try to narrow this down. Where is the odor primarily being smelled? Indoors or outdoors, because that's going to help you in a dramatic way when you arrive at the location. When we're talking about indoors, you also have to remember that chimneys, if they're constructed properly, are standalone and they are structurally unique from the building. So sometimes an animal may die above the damper in what we call the smoke shelf, and then the odor is permeating into the living room or the basement because it's coming through the damper. So it's going to be important for you to consider that as a possibility as well when you're thinking about chimneys. So definitely don't forget that as a third area. So we think about outdoor, indoor, chimney, right? And you could also add in on other things, outbuildings and garages and this sort of thing. So you want to think of things in terms of compartmentalization, but never let the evidence direct you where you're going. But you need to have a basic understanding of building construction and layout to be sure that you're not getting deceived in one way or the other. Because the odor, you may smell it here, but the odor can actually be, you may not be able to access it from that particular point. You may need to go a different direction to access where that odor ultimately is. If you're having difficulty locating where that odor is, have the client, or I would encourage you to do this the night before, have the client do this the night before you arrive. Tell them to close all the doors in the structure. And the reason is you were trying to concentrate the odor in the area where it's going to be the strongest, because you don't want to dilute it out. So by reducing the amount of air movement within the structure, you're going to have the odor is going to be concentrated, and that's what you're looking for. So when you arrive, you're then able to start in the area where the client hasn't smelled the odor and work your way through the building toward the place where the odor is the strongest. That way, when you're opening up a door, it's like, oh, okay, here it is. This is the spot. So now you're able to start thinking, okay, is it ceiling? Is it walls? Is it floor? And you're trying to evaluate where that odor may be emanating from. Once you have the room or the area where that odor is the strongest, figure out how are you going, check the room. It might be just something dead on the floor, right? But as you know, the client likely would have found those particular locations, but it depends how much clutter there is, of course, right? So you're going to have to start thinking about getting perhaps into the attic and then looking down the walls through the studs. Maybe you're going to get over that particular room area and be able to look down the wall or smell, and it may be able to come up like this. Now you may say, well, Stephen, I'm wearing a HEPA filter, as you should. But you still should be able to smell, you'll often be able to smell something, or at least be able to perhaps see some sign that there was activity in those particular studs, and then just, flashlight it through. Don't forget the basement, right? So you may have to go to the basement and look at where the studs are going up the walls. Those of you that have access to fiber optic type scopes, that can be helpful for you to find situations like that. Maybe even remove something like outlet covers. Be careful, don't electrocute yourself, to see if an odor is emanating from that a little bit more. So it's going to take some time. Now here's the key that you have to keep in mind. Be very careful about cutting into walls. Here's what happens, is that yes, sometimes mice get trapped in studs of walls. Why can't the mouse climb up? Well, sometimes the wood has been planed too smooth, or perhaps the mouse is too weak. A whole host of things could happen, right? But the point is that the mouse got trapped and died, and for some reason the airflow was sufficient to bring that odor out into where the homeowner could smell it. And maybe the homeowner had a very sensitive nose. Maybe the house is just really tight, or perhaps the mouse was a really big one, and it didn't dry out fast enough. Because when we're dealing with dead animal smells, for example, I know I'm spending a lot of time on dead animals, but that's going to be a common source of odor for you. If the animal dies and is able to dry out quickly, to really move through that decay period, that will reduce odor a lot. And also, if there's a lot of airflow in the attic, for example, the odor may never get strong enough to penetrate the house itself. So there's a lot of variables into why one house where you did some rodenticide poisoning and they smelled mice, yet another house that may have had more mice, no one smelled anything, right? It's kind of helter-skelter. It's kind of chaotic in this particular regard, so you need to be sensitive to that. But the point is you want to try to find ways to locate where those carcasses is, or the source of the odor, without having to cut into walls, because unless you're good, you might find yourself cutting, and then all of a sudden you're finding yourself on the wrong side of the stud. So things like stud finders, and be very clear. Make sure you get permission from the client to cut, and that you feel qualified enough to make repairs, or if you're not, that the client signed off. So maybe the client will fix it themselves. You have got to work that out, but make sure you have everything in writing so that everyone's memory stays the same after the job is done. I had one job. It was not an odor; it was a sound, and I cut into the wall. I had the client, point to the spot. We cut into the wall. Ultimately, it turned out that the sound wasn't in the wall. It was actually coming from an appliance on the other side of the wall, right? So don't be me. Do better than me. So don't make that mistake. And it was just sort of an unfortunate situation. So I think I actually made two cuts, one on one side of the stud and the other one on the other side of the stud. And then we heard it again, and it was on the other side of the wall. So this is that, avoid that rush to judgment, so that you want to be very methodical, very systematic, and this is where fiber optic scopes and having the client with you to help smell, to try to really, or maybe even one of your own co-workers, to really try to narrow this down so that you don't want to do anything rash here. Now, how do we remove the odor? How do we treat the odor? So we're trying to find the odor, of course. Now that we've located the odor, how do we remove the odor? Well, understand when we're dealing with odor removal, you have basically 4 key methods or strategies to reduce odor. One is you remove the source, right? Dead animal, I remove the dead animal, the source is gone, whatever's lingering in the air will dissipate. Option 2 is you mask the odor with another odor that's more pleasant. So you have bad odor, spray some perfume. People smell the perfume. They don't smell the bad odor. Sometimes that occurs with what's called olfactory fatigue, and that's just a fancy word meaning if someone's smelling an odor for an extended period of time, or the smell is really strong, sometimes it overwhelms your nasal passages, your odor sensors, so you're automatically going to be attached to a new odor that comes onto the scene. That's basically how tomato juice works when it comes to skunks. People think, oh, tomato juice works for skunks. No, it doesn't work for skunks. What happens is your nose is so overwhelmed with the odor of the skunk that when you introduce the tomatoes, it actually your nose smells the tomatoes, not the skunk odor, because you already wore out your nasal passages were already too tired of smelling the skunk odor. But masking is certainly an option in terms of, because again, if the odor is no longer being perceived, then it doesn't matter whether it's actually there or not. It may matter in the long run if the person goes to somebody else or they leave the house and come back. Now they may smell it again. Yes, that's true, but for the time being, you kind of remove at least the challenge of that odor at that particular time. So that's called masking. An alternative way, of course, is degrading the odor, and that is the solution to pollution is dilution. So if you're because there comes a threshold point where you're no longer able to smell the odor. If there are not enough odor molecules for that odor, you can't smell it. We're not dogs, right? So a dog can smell things at really small amounts of chemical presence. Humans need a lot more than that because dogs have so many more receptors in their nasal passages that we don't have. So you degrade it by diluting the odor presence so that it goes below the threshold where you can even smell it. There are certain odors, for example, I'm trying to think of a pesticide and it just escapes me at the moment of what that pesticide is, for example, but there is a pesticide that by the time you smell it, you've already exceeded the what's believed to be the safe exposure level. I think it's what is the name of that particular chemical? It's used to knock out ether. Ether is one of those chemicals. By the time you smell it, you've already exceeded what the EP or OSHA's recommended standard for safety. Because I think it's 10 parts per million, and that's when you can smell it, but the threshold is like 5 parts per million if memory serves. But for odor purposes, not for safety purposes, but for odor purposes, if we can get the odor diluted down, well, the person can't smell it anymore because it's too dilute. Okay, it's like a weak tea, right? You keep pouring water into the tea, and sooner or later the tea is still there, but it's such a small amount you can't even taste it anymore. It's just like tasting water. Okay. The last method is what's called encapsulation, and that is you basically prevent the molecules from dissipating from the source. If the molecules can't dissipate from the source, it can't get into the air and then can't be smelled. So think of it like putting it into a hermetically sealed container. If it's hermetically sealed, the odor can't leave. And then you basically, it's almost the equivalent of removing the source, but you're not. You're simply encasing it in something so that the odor can't leave. So those are your 4 options. And by the way, you can use those options in any combination. It's not like you can only use one and not the others. You can use all 4, right? So those are certainly things that can be done in terms of treating those particular odors. So do you want the client to do this deodorizing, or do you want to be doing the deodorizing? And so just as a sort of refresher here, what are some things you can tell the client to do or suggest for the client to do? You could say just air movement, air out the house, keep fresh air coming in to kind of, that's that dilution element to try to reduce that odor down. And that can still be required even if you remove the source. There's going to be things lingering around. They're going to need to dilute that out and air out the house, to be sure. Washing clothes. This can be very important for people that have had skunk odor, especially if that skunk odor's permeated the house. Perhaps the dog that got sprayed came into the bedroom, this sort of thing. Washing clothes can be an important part of trying to freshen things up. Make sure you don't forget to change the air filters. Tell the client to change their air filters, because if they've had maybe an air conditioner or a heater, well, those air filters are going to be capturing particles that are going to be contaminated with various odors, and sometimes you just need to change those out with a fresh one. I want to thank a colleague of mine. He's passed on, and that was certainly his idea, and I want to thank him for that particular idea. And wherever he is. Candles. Now, be careful with candles because they tip over and they can cause fires, right? I knew someone who had scented candles in their home. It wasn't an odor issue per se. They just candles. They had it near an open window. The wind blew, and I guess the curtain knocked the candle over and kind of burned their house. So candles are dangerous. You want to definitely be cautious, but again, this is something the client is doing. But scented candles can be very helpful, right? Because you're kind of masking, and also the candle is moving air. Okay, it's heating up air. It's going to be pulling some air from other locations. So candles can certainly be helpful. And then lastly, of course, deodorizing chemicals can be helpful. And there's a variety of those on the market. And, there's things you have to read about those as well. But that's if you want, your client to do it. And there's a lot of advantages for having your client do it in the sense that it reduces your liability, right? You're not going to be in trouble because that way the client is doing it on their own and it's not you doing it. So talk to any of your attorneys, and since if you're making some suggestions, always keep repeating, follow the label. Does someone have a chemical sensitivity? We're becoming a very litigious society here, so this is probably something you want to have a conversation with a qualified attorney from your state or the states that you're working in or wherever, just to make sure that how do we approach this. I mean, these are some of the things that our industry really kind of needs to get some clarification for. Also, if you are deciding to do this deodorizing work yourself, you need to be sure that you're following both the EPA guidelines, because this may be considered as a pesticide, or your state pesticide regulators may be treating this as a pesticide and requiring you to have appropriate training and licensing to do deodorizing. So again, you've got to do a little bit of research for your particular state, whether it asks, if I'm doing deodorizing work, is this going to be an issue? Do I need to get a license? Now remember, some deodorizing products may have a pesticidal component, like killing bacteria or removing mold or something like this. So you need to be sure, so things can cross over into a pesticidal realm, whereas other chemicals wouldn't be pesticides, they're just deodorants. without any type of an active ingredient trying to control something. So make sure you get that worked out with your clients. So if there can be money in this, it is something to, and certainly you can be helpful for your clients. They may be grateful for it. And in some cases, if you're doing things like with sheds away from structures, other structures, the liability may be quite low because there's no people living there. But when you start getting into buildings where people are residing, and be particularly careful in food preparation areas, be very careful of the chemicals you're using and how you're using it. So make sure you have a good handle on those labels and that you're legal, and you may need maybe separate paperwork to treat those types of situations. So where can you learn more about deodorizing? This may be something you even want to hand your clients, for example, if they're dealing with skunks. She says, well, but you're talking about things beyond skunk odor. Yes, that's true. But the point is the principles in deodorizing, many of the deodorizing techniques, not all of them, but many of the deodorizing techniques will work for odors beyond skunk. There's a couple, I believe, in there that are more skunk-centered, but it talks about the theory of odor removal, and that can be very helpful for you in your work, and I'm sure there are other publications out there as well. But this is something you can download at no additional cost. Those of you that listen to my podcast know that I hate the term free when it comes to quasi-government type material. I wasn't part of the government when I wrote this, but I was being paid for by tax dollars in terms of this work. So it's not free. It's just something you don't have to pay for again, because I was certainly paid for that work. So it was like a work for hire and that type of endeavor there. So just look it up. There's the URL at the top there. It's at wildlife.unl.edu/PDFs/removing skunk-odor.pdf. Now, you're probably not going to remember all that. So just do a search term on deodorizing skunk Vantassel. That's V as in Victor, Antassel. Deodorizing skunk Vantassel, and it'll come right up. Let me just sort of show you that really quickly. But there's my contact information if you're wanting to get a hold of me. So let me just pull up this other page. So here I have deodorizing skunk Vantassel. I'm just going to hit the search bar here. And then there it is. It's actually after you get below the ads, it's the #1 link. And there you go. Removing skunk odor. I wrote it with Dr. Hingstrom and Dennis Ferraro back in 2005. So still relevant even today in a lot of its theory. And so that can be helpful for you as well. So to sort of close this out here, there's my contact information again. Do take a few moments, if you'd be so kind, as to subscribe to the channel. Definitely, you can reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your comments and thoughts, suggestions for shows. Perhaps you want to be interviewed on the show, or you think that there's a company out there that should be interviewed for the show, and perhaps I can get them on the show. So would love to hear your ideas, and of course even criticisms. We'll take those as well. Again, that's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Well, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Do join us on Facebook if you would, where we have the Pest Geek podcast family, where we can ask questions and share our victories and our challenges together. Join the revolution, as Franklin calls it. So we're glad to have you there. And again, this is Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, we call it Living the Wildlife because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.